Jonathan Clements here, back one last time for episode 6, which throws a curveball to first-time viewers by suddenly switching into black and white. And do not assume, as some unwise pundits have done, that making anime in black and white is somehow a cheaper option. They are actually working here in monochrome and widescreen, which means more work for them. There's more than one kind of black, of course, so these gradations of grey have to be monitored in just the way that colours would be. And Toshio Okada says in his memoirs that he wanted the episode to be black and white because old-school science fiction felt more futuristic to him. And I guess he was referring to some of the garish colours of 1960s and 1970s sci-fi, which date those films all too easily. He says there was originally a plan to shoot the flashbacks to Noriko's father in black and white as well, but that all fell through. So what we have here is something deliberately evocative of 8-Man and Ultra Q, and also of old movies. And one in particular this early scene really evokes for me is 24 Eyes, which is a film about a teacher who for various reasons ends up teaching the same class at different points in their lives. So she sort of time travels through their growth as adults. And it's a film about the sacrifices made by women, particularly in wartime. And in 1954, which was the year of both Godzilla and the Seven Samurai, 24 Eyes was the most popular film in Japan. So while those other films get all the foreign attention, 24 Eyes is just as evocative of the Japanese zeitgeist. And I certainly get a sense of 24 Eyes in this scene, as Kazumi's class rush over to say goodbye to her, presenting her with 1,000 origami cranes, itself a symbol of the Japanese peace movement in our time, particularly as related to the bombing of Hiroshima. And there is a repeated motif in this episode, first from the girls, then from Kashihara, and later on from Jung, that everyone will be waiting for their return. The tragedy being that everybody back on Earth is going to be dead, one way or another, before Kazumi ever comes home. And the title of this episode might seem at first to evoke Isaac Asimov's time travel novel, The End of Eternity, but it's actually a reference to Sakio Komatsu's 1965 story At the End of the Endless Stream, in which time travellers flee a dying Earth by retreating into the past. There are in fact several references to the work of Komatsu in this episode. He's best known for Japan Sinks, of course, the ultimate Japanese disaster novel, adapted into an anime by Masaaki Yuasa, and I'll do my best to point them out, because shortly after Gunbuster, Gainax would work on a little-known anime series called the Sakio Komatsu Anime Theatre, adapting 25 of his stories into 5-minute shorts. The very idea of a space elevator, of course, is something popularised in the work of Arthur C. Clarke in The Fountains of Paradise, to which this episode alludes. Clarke's book states there are only 2 places on Earth that it can be built. One is India, where his book takes place, and the other is the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which, since Hawaii is Japanese imperial territory in this story, means Hawaii is the ideal location. And some of the adverts around this carriage make it very clear just how Japanese Hawaii now is. There's one for Aerial City 008, which was a puppet show, really Japan's answer to Thunderbirds from the 1960s, based on a story by Sakio Komatsu. And you'll also see in this episode Simoraku Milk and Otokoyama Sake, both of which are brands from Hideaki Anno's home province. But I think the point they're trying to make here really is that Hawaii is so Japanese in this future of Gunbuster that there's no English language signage on any of their public transport. And Big Sister just has a little comment here about how only time will be able to judge humanity's actions, and that for now they just have to get on with self-preservation and worry later about the consequences. And that's something that we're going to deal with later in this episode. But we're shortly going to cut to the fleet at the centre of the galaxy, where there are some meaningful indicators of how much technology has accelerated. One is a simple size of Buster Machine 3, because we see it dwarfing an Excellion-class ship as it warps out. Another is the levitation pads on the bridge of the Eltrium, something which would be reused later by Gainax in Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water. But this is also the first time that we hear mention of Project Carneades, a reference here to ancient Hellenistic philosophy that goes to the heart of Gunbuster. Carneades was a man from North Africa, roughly 214 to 129 BC, one of the academic skeptics in Hellenistic philosophy, who was famous for a very tough line on the nature of justice. He's most famous for his commentary on what's known as the Plank of Carneades, which is a question of what would happen if two shipwrecked sailors fought over a plank of wood, if only one of them could survive. So Sailor A kills Sailor B, and when Sailor A is rescued by another ship, Carneades asks, is it just to put him on trial for murder when it was a matter of life and death that he hang on to that plank? And Carneades instead argued that this murderous act, however terrible, might instead be regarded as an act of self-defence. And I think you can see how that rhetoric lends itself to the awful position in which humanity would find itself in this. Later in life, Carneades would argue with the Romans that justice was inevitably problematic as a concept and was more to do with running a society than delivering what was truly just. And before he died, he became very bitter about the fact he was going blind, and once asked, why does nature undo what she herself has done? And as you can see, another oblique reference to the plot of Gunbuster. And as we await the arrival of Buster Machine 3 at the centre of the galaxy, there is a little dialogue scene between two men who are high up in Project Carneades, and one of them ends by saying, now all that's left is for us to believe in a miracle. And that is the third Sakio Komatsu reference in this episode, because it's a little tip of the hat to a famous scene in Japan Sinks. Plenty of other tips on the hat on the way when we see the memorabilia in Noriko's cabin coming up. Not just a model kit box marked Space Cruiser Yamato, but a poster for The War in Space, Wakusei Daisenso, a 1977 live-action film in which, spoiler warning, the heroes save the human race at the end by crashing their battleship into a volcano and destroying the planet Venus. Sound familiar? So, Noriko also has a poster on the wall of a double bill of My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies, which was the original way those two films were released in 1988. Her wall also has some nice little memorabilia from her past, including a photograph of Coach and Kazumi's wedding, a group shot in which Jungfruid is literally climbing Coach Ota like a tree, and a pennant that reads Mars, which is not a mission mentioned in the series proper, although it's either a mission in the later PlayStation game or something that Gainax toyed with and then dropped. And of course, a massive poster, Thunderbirds, a show greatly beloved of Hideaki Anno, as well as piles of Animage magazine, the thinking fan's journal of Japanese animation. But all of those things are now coming up in this scene, which I feel is also an unspoken subtext for much of Gainax's 1980s work, which is a vague sense of guilt or even apprehension that they are still playing with childish things while the rest of the world around them is moving on. For those of us that work in the creative arts, we have to believe in ourselves. We have to believe that the project we are working on is the greatest thing ever. Otherwise, we are not going to put the hours in. And here in this scene, Noriko is faced with everything she's given up from the normal, from the mundane world, as a science fiction fan would say. The fact that their old friend Kimiko now has a daughter who is essentially the same age as Noriko, if not older, and whose voice, incidentally, is provided by the same voice actress who played the teenage Kimiko, and Noriko's left all that behind. And even her old friend Kazumi is now suddenly a generation older than her. And Kimiko's letter, by the way, is gut-wrenchingly formal, like they've become strangers now, which only adds to the pathos. She even tells her to take care of her health in a very mumsy fashion. So, as we get ready for the final phase of Operation Carneades, there are a swift number of references packed in, often flitting by in just a second. So this is why I'm going through them now, so I'm not reacting to them directly on screen. So there's going to be the Sizzler mass-produced Gunbuster unit, which derives its name from the Sizzler model cars, and its head from Gaos, the famous movie monster. There is a whole fleet of Exelion-class vessels. There's a dolphin on the bridge of the Eltrium, which is just a throwaway moment here, presumably inspired a little bit by Jones from Johnny Mnemonic. But it would become an idea that Rick Sternbach would really run with in Star Trek, including a little throwaway line, report to Cetacean Ops, something you would also see in After-War Gundam X in 1996. So all kinds of little throwaway asides here in this preparation scene, some of which would inspire, whole areas of Star Trek design. And then there's the Buster Machine 3 itself, which originally was inspired by the description in Larry Niven's known space books of the General Products No. 4 hull, a giant sphere which in that universe is the largest spaceship ever built, although its dimensions are an order of magnitude below what we've got here by compressing Jupiter into a bomb. You might also like to consider the irony of an infection to the galaxy being cured by a giant pill, but I'm not even sure if that was a joke Gainax intended. There is, however, some sneaky recycling of footage coming up. I'm pretty sure that some of the artillery opening sequences, for example, are reusing the colour cells from earlier episodes, but just with the colour bleached out so they're not so obvious. And one last Jung Freud turbo cow moment back there as she slaps Big Sister while handing her the keys to Buster Machine 2. There's something I've never brought up before regarding Gunbuster, at least not in English, and that's the resonance, colour and style-wise, between this final episode and the original ending of Space Cruiser Yamato. Noburo Ishiguro wrote at length about the ending of Space Cruiser Yamato in his memoirs, and I want to précis as much of that as I can here because I think it's relevant. Firstly, Yamato's ending, like the ending of many other serials, was a mad scramble against the clock for completion. And that's the thing with anime. More often than not, you're running against a timetable, and there is no theoretical limit on the amount of work required. You can always do better. You can always improve things a little bit. You can always go back and add just one little tweak to make something, 0.5% more fun than it was before. And so that tends to put animators in an impossible situation. And in fact, there was an incident on the production of Wings of Oniamis when Yoshiyuki Sadamoto was dragged away by some of the producers to draw a poster for the film, and Toshio Okada lost it because he needed Sadamoto working on the film, which still wasn't finished, and the 3 days he lost him for were 3 days that now weren't getting done on the film itself, and that's not time you can get back, well, at least not in theory. Similarly, with Space Cruiser Yamato, the last days of the production were also very rushed, and Ishiguro reports that the studio was a mess, with lots of dust and debris getting in the cells, and the animators were struggling to keep everything looking clean. But when they showed it to the producer, Yoshinobu Nishizaki, he shocked them all by saying it looked too clean, and he wanted the cells to look dirty. And they thought he was going nuts, but he had his reasons. Because he grew up in the closing days of the war, and he wanted the last episodes to evoke the war era, when if there was some huge bit of news, like a lost battle or something, there would be an extra edition of the newspaper, which would be rushed out onto the streets in 20 minutes, and it would be blotchy, and it would have ink around the edges and typos and blank spots. But for him, coming from that war generation, that would naturally evoke a sense of urgency, a sense of the wheels coming off the bus, and that's what he wanted in Yamato. I will also say that Yamato, being made when it was in the early 1970s, was made in colour, but it was made in an era when many viewers still had black and white television sets, and so it was one of the last big shows that really had to consider the impact of space age scenes, particularly the blackness of space and the darkness of space, when considered in a monochrome form. I think it's a cunning touch in Gunbuster that their black and white final battle is fought at the centre of the galaxy where space is white, because that helps offset some of the complaints Yamato had about people not being able to see what was going on. And so I want you to bear all of that in mind here at the 14-minute mark, when after that huge build-up, we suddenly go to a montage of still images, all part of the plan. Toshio Okada said that they had originally been a plan to switch to colour when the final episode began, but Hideaki Anno does have a penchant for going minimalist when all his critics expect the opposite. So we have some great rostrum work here, some shots using Nami glass to make this appear to move more than it does, and because I'm a nerd like that, I've counted through the images in this montage, and there are no more than 50 of them. So if you were running them through a camera as a limited animation in the style of Astro Boy, then they would take about 6 seconds. But here they have been judiciously stretched over a whole minute, and these are not cheap little sketches, they are beautifully detailed drawings, and the subject matter is exploding worlds, to the extent they're almost saying the human eye can't really comprehend this, so we are going crude. And we get this little rundown in the style of Kihachi Okamoto of how many ships have been lost, or in fact literally sunk, and how many are still standing. And I will just point out as well that scale is something else the human mind has difficulty conceiving of at this level. So you need to take a step back and really appreciate that if Buster Machine 3 has been made out of Jupiter, then the size of those craters on its hull must be truly gigantic. But that just leaves us with the ultimate irony. After all is said and done, after millions of lives have been lost and ruined, the Buster Machine 3's slave generators are not fully operational. There is not enough power of force or mass or whatever it is that will tip Buster Machine 3 over the edge into a black hole. And that means it's all been for nothing, and this is a fantastic evocation of the abyss between very large and very small, because now it's all going to come down to two girls in a single machine determining the fate of the entire universe. And there's no commentary track over the Gunbuster science lectures on this Blu-ray, but I'm sure you are aware of them and the metatextual explanations and filler that they provide that bolsters at least some of the science and pseudoscience in Gunbuster with a little bit more energy. There is also a timeline in the Gunbuster Encyclopedia, repeated in the Gunbuster Perfect Guide, that outlines some of the developments that led to the human race's understanding of warp technology and ether physics. The most important name in that chronology is, of course, Dr. Tannhauser, whose name has been derived directly from that throwaway line that Roy Batty has at the end of Blade Runner, when he says, "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I've watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain." And Tannhauser himself, of course, derives from Wagner's opera based on the medieval folk tale, but I think that's a rabbit hole too far, even for this commentary, let alone Gainax. And the dialogue between the Admiral and Noriko here is evocative, of course, of the old rhetoric of the kamikaze pilots, who were expected to turn themselves into human bombs as a last-ditch attempt to maintain Japan's absolute defence line in World War II. And Admiral Tashiro is strangely squeamish about it, bearing in mind the number of deaths he's presided over in the last 22 subjective minutes. But he's a man of principle, and he doesn't want Noriko to turn into a human bomb. There's some nice little pipe-laying here about why they can't just send in an unmanned ship, and then Kazumi turns up to announce they can go home together. And this ritual, this litany of returning home, is a huge motif within both Gainax and otaku culture in general. And if you're interested in pursuing this further, I recommend the works of Patrick Galbraith, such as Otaku and the Struggle for Imagination in Japan, in which he points out that this sense of coming home formed part of the ritualized dialogue of maid cafes and other places that are safe spaces for otaku, to the extent that sometimes people are even asked on entry, "Are you coming home for the first time?" So, the massive final battle, a cataclysmic event of E.E. Doc Smith proportions, is over in 50 seconds of still images, but the girls' last goodbye as they descend into Buster Machine 3 takes 3 solid minutes. A wonderful evocation of the way that the priorities in this story continuously wrong foot the expectations, not of melodrama in general, but certainly of military science fiction and blockbuster movies. Toei, in their heyday, the Toei studio, famously had a climax model of storytelling which was then a very B-movie mentality, today much more mainstream, for which the idea was that whatever happened in a movie for the first 80 minutes, the ending had to be a massive, explosive, amazing finale, because those were the days when cinema audiences were captive. They'd paid their money, and they might even be trying to just get out of the rain, but it was important for the filmmakers was delivering something that they would remember as they left the cinema. And Gunbuster has a deeply moving ending and a fantastic final episode, but remarkably little space combat, which one expects most of its fans were, if not expecting, then at least hoping for when they arrived. And it came loaded, as I hope I've demonstrated, with all sorts of asides and nudges about the world of science fiction, which I hope you've appreciated. I haven't even mentioned all of them. If you go through this series with the pause button, you will see a bunch of things I never got around to mentioning, like the craft from the movie Fantastic Voyage and a couple of sneaky Star Wars references. If anything dates this, it's the fan service, Not that fan service is absent today, but this was made at a time when it was largely assumed that fandom was male and that fandom was ridiculously excited about the sight of pretty girls wiggling and jiggling. I think Noriko and Kazumi and even Jung are fantastic protagonists, really great characters, but they do exist in a milieu populated by frankly lecherous cameramen. But if you look beyond that, at the appreciation of the female form, it can still get away with it. When Noriko rips out Gunbuster's heart, which is coming up in a couple of minutes, she bears one breast, which is kind of a reference to Amazonian warriors, but let's face it, from what we know about the crew, it's also just an excuse to see a boob, and something that Gainax would take to later extreme by producing a Gunbuster-themed strip poker game. No, I'm not making this up, it's Denno Gakuen 3, in case you are wondering. So Gunbuster is a vital hit title in the history of Gainax, a real masterpiece of a particular kind of anime, as deserving of historical importance in my mind as their movie success with Wings of Oniamis and their later successes like the world-beating Neon Genesis Evangelion. It would form an important seedbed for much of the way that Gainax was regarded by fandom over the years, and indeed by other animators. And sharp-eyed viewers may notice that some of the dynamics here are repeated elsewhere later on. I mean, for example, there's a lot of Noriko and Kazumi in the two leads of Tengen Toppa Gurren Lagann, although many of Gurren Lagann's fans had probably never even heard of Gunbuster. And there was talk in 2019 of Hideaki Anno trying to acquire the rights to Gunbuster from Gainax in order to remake it in some unspecified form, but that fell through. And I can't say I mind, because I'm really just happy to see Gunbuster restored and buffed up and digitally preserved. It has, in the past, been quite poorly served, particularly in my native United Kingdom, where there was a DVD release many years ago, but it was a terrible telecine transfer with no extras, and I've no idea what other extras there will be in this Blu-ray, but I know for sure this commentary will be there, so that must amount to something. Because if you made it this far listening to me talk away, it has presumably doubled the running time of the disc at very least. And what, you may wonder, is lying in wait for the people of the fleet when they get home? Well, firstly, time dilation being what it is, Noriko and Kazumi's friends do also have a very long trip back to Earth, and they will not get back themselves until the year 2245, whereupon they are plunged almost immediately into a war back on Earth. That ultimately ends with the somewhat unexpected election of Jung Freud as the president of the Galactic Federation. So in fact, after her military service, she actually ends up going into politics. That is all another story told in the Gunbuster manga and I think in the Gunbuster novels, which have not, to my knowledge, been legally translated into English. There is, of course, also Diebuster, which does slot into the chronology of Gunbuster, but I'm not sure there's an easy way for me to explain that without basically giving away the end of Diebuster. So anyway, in the abortive project Gunbuster Next Generation, which was a kind of manga project, it turns out that after the fleet left for the centre of the galaxy, a bunch of humans settled on Sirius and became the Syrian Federation, which declares war on an Earth desperately impoverished by the sheer effort and expense of producing Buster Machine 3. And this is the war in which Jung Freud and the returnees intervene. And just for a moment here, we cut back to Earth and we have a little echo of that telepathy subplot that was mooted and imagined and then dropped from earlier in the series, as Kimiko believes that she can hear Noriko calling out to her, but it is gone in a flash, like tears in rain. And the date that next comes up on screen is famously 12,000 years later, although you may also notice that it is July the 6th. In fact, by the time Noriko and Kazumi are back on Earth, it is actually July the 7th, which is the day of the release of the Gunbuster video. So much like the opening shot of Akira, this is a show that actively references the time of its original release. And then a little note about the big iconic shot that ends this, the Okaeri Nasai, written in the lights of Earth. There was, and continues to be, massive speculation among fandom about the fact that the Earth lights up like this at the end because Jung Freud does threaten to be waiting for them when they get back. But this is a subject that has been discussed at length by the makers, Tor and Smith actually asked Hiroyuki Yamaga what it was all about and what was the meaning of that transposed final letter. And Toshio Okada in his memoirs has also explained it in very similar terms, which is as follows. 12,000 years have passed. Earth has changed beyond all recognition, and we're looking at a gap in time not unlike that between our present day and the end of the last ice age. So writing a message to these people arriving from space requires a forensic, archaeological effort akin to trying to work out how to say welcome home in Egyptian or ancient Sumerian or Linear B. It requires such an effort that the people involved have not got it quite right. And like a nerd, I did scour the handwriting of the various Gunbuster characters, hoping to find evidence somewhere that, say, Jung reversed her eyes too. That last letter is an I in Japanese, although I suspect when it's subtitled here, it will be rendered as an inverted K, because that helps retain the kind of punchline of the visual gag. And in Gunbuster, at least in Gunbuster entirely self-contained, as this video series indeed was at the time of its release, we are left completely in mystery about what the Earth is like when they get back, a topic covered to some extent in a jokey aside in the later science lectures, but also in other media, if you know where to look. I personally prefer not to know. I think that Gunbuster is perfect and self-contained as it is, and this is where I choose to leave the story. Unless, of course, some wealthy millionaire client puts their hands in their pockets and asks for a commentary track on Diebuster. But for now, it has been an absolute pleasure being able to talk at such great length about my favourite anime, and believe it or not, there are still some things left to say. Hopefully, however, the last 3 hours of commentary have helped you appreciate just some of the things going on behind the scenes in this wonderful show, which I think really demonstrates the glory of creative expression when a group of true talents are thrown together. And also, it shows the way that we can contextualise and cite an anime within the history of the Japanese animation industry and business, which is always fun. I have been Jonathan Clements, the author of Anime A History, published by the British Film Institute, and I hope to run into you again sometime on the next occasion that your finger inadvertently slips on the audio selection button.